I always think of all my shows as installations, as open-ended narratives. I really do think about the order and the juxtapositions of one image to the next and how, in sort of a prose poem-like way, they end up telling stories. Now, I want this to be sort of an epic that had a micromanaged interior narrative life, but also hopefully had some universal value to be able to talk about our world and our city of New York. If the previous images were sort of our first act, where I was introducing the cosmology and the players, this is sort of the second act, where we open up the narrative and bring in ideas of the city and America, where we are right now, as hopefully a culture in the world. You know, this is a picture of the American flag, obviously beating in the wind. Just because we're struggling as a nation, hopefully we'll remain a powerful one and economically rich and so on, but it is a struggle. And I feel that this is sort of about planting our flag and hopefully beating the tide and be able to stand strong as a nation. I'm also interested in trying to capture movement in my paintings, and I think it's really interesting with digital technology, how it's able to capture sort of like these in-betweens of movement and stillness, and that was really important to me here. And also, I love how in the old masters they would set up narrative, allegorical situations that they would sort of think about, and maybe while they're thinking about the form of color and negative and positive space, the content of what they were thinking about would seep through. Maybe as a son of a psychoanalyst, I really believe in the ideas of the unconscious, or unconscious sort of seeps through too. And so for me here, it was really interesting how the painting would open up and break into maybe figurative other worlds. Also how I was able to sort of track movement. It was my goal with this painting to have, even though it's a still image of course, a feeling that the flag was constantly moving and beating in the wind, standing strong even in our perilous times. Next to the flag painting in this project room space is the painting of Empire, the Empire State Building. Of course the flag is also a commentary on John's flag and maybe notions of post-modernity. I feel that Johns and Rauschenberg necessarily were undermining the previous generation of the Abex artists and bringing Duchamp into the fray to talk about ideas outside of the painting itself. And famously, the Johns flag was a painting not of a window onto another world, but it was a painting that was a flag. I want to make that a window onto another world. This obviously relates a little bit to Andy Warhol's famous Empire movie, where he just set up a camera and left and videotaped or filmed the Empire State Building for a long time. I wanted to bring back the sense of what that building is really like, the sense of space, the sense of environment, its majesty that I still admire every day when I look at the Empire State Building. I took many different photos of it throughout the years. I've done pictures of buildings before. In fact, in this room in my last show, there are pictures of 9/11 and the World Trade Center, a horrific disaster. For this one, I want to be a little bit more optimistic and yet comment a little bit again on where we are as a nation and as a city still struggling economically to stay on top, and as an empire to be able to stay strong. Now, I also love the Carl Andre brick sculpture that was called Empire, and it was sort of teetering. In this painting, even though hopefully it's majestic, it is a little teetering. Of course, there's sort of this, in my mind, romantic kind of pathos that's also permeating this picture, really because I've been reading the news and thinking about where we are and realizing it's not completely optimistic, and yet, again, like I think there is hope. And so, kind of like those early King Kong pictures of the RKO radio tower at the very beginning, I think that this was sort of hopefully vibrating in sort of energy. And also, a show called My Modern Life, this is commenting on obviously great Art Deco architecture in New York, probably post-Art Deco times. I mean, if modern times are about the Bauhaus and so on, this is sort of looking back at a previous time, sort of the allegory of a ruin, looking at sort of the civilization that would be able to build these majestic buildings. I don't know if people know this, but this was actually built so Zeppelins would be able to disembark people to the roof, and there was like a lot of visionary utopic ideas associated with this building that I think are still there, despite the fact that we don't have Zeppelins disembarking on it. So after the Empire building, there's another great Art Deco masterpiece, I think, of architecture in New York, the famous New Yorker Hotel. Now, the New Yorker Hotel has its own great history. It was one of the biggest hotels built at its time. It had its own telephone operating system, of course, but also its own energy. They had their own generator there. They had a gigantic barber shop. All the big bands played here, and then famously or infamously, Tesla spent his last 20 years holed up in the New Yorker Hotel. And I think that's indicative a little bit of how I perceive it now. It went into a state of sort of ruination for 20 years. They had closed it, and then I believe the Moonies took it over. Now that Ramada Inn has refurbished it and is trying to make it a great hotel again. And every time that I pass by it, we got a car recently, and I would park it in Penn Station. I would actually go right past this hotel, looking at the Empire State Building, right past that flag, which is on the corner of 25th and 10th. And there was something about this, some sort of King Kong kind of, again, I guess, grandiosity about this building. And yet, I thought it was ironic that the neon famous sign had lost some of its lights, and yet there's still this sort of patina of integrity about this place and pride. You know, I took a lot of pictures of this in the twilight hour of New York City. I enjoyed this particular one though because it had leaves on a tree that was on the other side of the street, and I felt this was sort of the surrogate of human agency or nature versus man's, you know, hubris building almost the sort of Tower of Babel of the New Yorker that's still standing strong, yet maybe it's sort of collapsing a little bit, but in every little window there's a different story, and it was really fun and romantic painting this. And I was listening to Miles Davis in his entire catalog. We were going through it, and just sort of like a Miles or a jazz musician riffing off a melody and taking it in its own direction. With this one, it's a little looser, it's a little bit more painterly, as I was able to really let my feelings go while I was enjoying painting this picture. And then after the New Yorker, to bring us back into the main gallery, as sort of the conclusion of the second act, is this picture of the corner of 39th and 10th Avenue. Now, I was reading the famous T.J. Clark book about the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists, and it was intriguing to me that when Gauguin and Van Gogh and people like that were painting Paris, they didn't want to do the tourist version of Paris with the Eiffel Tower and so on. Rather, they would go to the outskirts of Paris looking in and capture that real Parisian sensibility of the people who lived there, what the city was like. For me, this has always been an incredible vista. This is actually Port Authority, and not necessarily the most picturesque view of New York. However, it has this sort of hill where you can really see Times Square and all the buildings. Years ago, they had a billboard of Hancock, the Will Smith movie about the hapless superhero, and I felt it was almost like he was trying to save New York. And since then, I've always wanted to do this image. But I went out on the same evening that I took the New Yorker hotel image, and it was raining, and I was trying to get the best shot, and it was intriguing to me that in this sort of twilight hour, when the rain had actually got on my lens, it created these great halos of light, and I was really intrigued that it felt transported, or it felt transcendent. And I listened to all of Dante's Divine Comedy when I was doing this picture. Like with all of these, I tried to listen and create an environment that has something to do with the picture while I'm creating it. But I went from the Inferno and the Nine Circles of H-E-L-L all the way to Paradise, and I kind of hope that this sort of captures that similar feeling where you have sort of a monk-like, perhaps, kind of figure that looks destitute here, and maybe you could sort of feel the sort of bowels of New York, and yet, like everybody comes to New York to make it into the world and hopefully become even a better person, I feel that all these sort of halos represent people in New York trying to aspire to get to an idea of paradise that might be exemplary by the wonderful colors and just sort of the arena that's happening in the sky here. So I also feel it's almost like a giant spaceship or something like that. There's a little bit of science fiction involved with this one, but also sort of a spirituality and maybe a belief and a hope that places like New York could be dynamic cultural arenas where amazing things could be created and wonderful things could happen. That shows our strength as not necessarily the city of lights, but the city of hopefully wonderfully talented, intelligent beings trying to make the world a better place in every way that they